been seized. What's the threat level tonight in Europe?
The fear is high. Obviously, they consider the threat level to be extremely high. They believe that the possibility of another terror attack is not just out there, but the possibility, Chris, of a chemical or biological attack. And you can see just how wide a net they are casting with those numbers. By now, probably more than 800 raids that they have done. I think the significant number you talked about is the number of weapons they have confiscated. Remember how tough the laws are here, but 174 arms seized, 18 of which are weapons of war, 84 long arms, 68 handguns. Also, 64 cases of narcotics, drugs being one of the key ways that ISIS is self-funding, and 250,000 euros. In the meantime, Chris, we're learning new information about who we thought was the female suicide bomber, the cousin of the mastermind. In fact, now officials are saying she did not blow herself up. It's Hasna Ayet Boulassin. She was someone who communicated with police. She was asking them to come, help me. And then she had that conversation about, he's not my boyfriend, he's not my boyfriend. The person who ran the raid said they believed that she was trying to get police to come in, so when that bomb exploded, they would be closer and that she would take them down with her, Chris.
Wow. Thank you so much, Chris Jansen. Great work this week. Welcome back to Harbor. That was President Obama yesterday on the alarmist and bellicose rhetoric we've been hearing from Republicans in the aftermath of the Paris tragedy. Since Friday, the Republican candidates for president have taken a hawkish stand, especially when it comes to the Syrian refugee issue. They're even hawkish on that one. Yesterday, Dr. Ben Carson used an analogy likening to dogs with rabies. That's what he's calling these people, dogs with rabies. Let's listen.
You know, if there's a rabid dog running around in your neighborhood, you're probably not going to assume something good about that dog, and you're probably going to put your children out of the way.
Well, speaking about the refugees on Fox, Ted Cruz said their religion encourages them to lie and that the president wants to admit the same people that carried out the Paris attacks into this country.
There is a religious philosophy in Islamism that encourages them to lie to carry out jihad. We know that at least one of the terrorists who committed these horrible attacks in Paris came in with the refugees, and President Obama and Hillary Clinton and the Democrats are willing to allow those same refugees to come to our shores, and apparently they're willing to just roll the dice and take the risk that hundreds or, God forbid, thousands of Americans will be murdered by jihadists.
Thousands of Americans will be killed by jihadists in this country if we let the refugees come in. Anyway, frontrunner Donald Trump told Yahoo News that, quote, we're going to have to do certain things that were frankly unthinkable a year ago. And when asked about placing Muslims in a national database, he didn't rule it out. And then last night, Trump told an NBC News reporter that he'd absolutely enact such a program if he becomes president.
Should there be a database system that tracks the Muslims here in this country?
There should be a lot of systems beyond database. I mean, we should have a lot of systems. And today you can do it. But right now we have to have a border, we have to have strength, we have to have a wall, and we cannot let what's happening to this country happen.
But that's something your White House would like to implement.
Oh, I would certainly implement that. Absolutely.
For Muslims specifically, how do you actually get them registered into a database?
It would be just good management. What you have to do is good management procedures. And we can do that. That's nice.
I mean, do you go to mosques and sign these people up into the system?
Different places. You sign them up at different, but it's all about management. Our country has no management.
Well, today Trump tweeted this clarification. I didn't suggest a database. A reporter did. We must defeat Islamic terrorism and have surveillance, including a watch list to protect America. I'm joined now by MSNBC political analyst David Corn of Mother Jones, as well as Paul Singer, Washington correspondent with USA Today. So he obviously is sharpening up what was a kind of a sloppy statement. Right. Putting together a database, well, okay, I don't know how we keep track of religion in this country, but you certainly want to keep a lookout for people that give you reason for suspicion, which is where he's working his way back to sanity here.
But at the same time, he's also called for possibly closing down mosques, making Muslims carry identification papers.
Has he actually done that?
Yeah. So
wait a minute. Where's the? Let's get back to this. Where did he say about identification papers?
First read of NBC News this morning. They outlined some of the statements he's made, and so it's all the same piece that Muslims are the other. Yeah. You know, this is what the argument that a lot of them try to make about Barack Obama, the secret Muslim, and they're feeding the fear or responding to the fear and paranoia of a good part of Americans, but particularly of the Republican primary electorate. Yeah. They want a visceral reaction, and they're equating terrorism with Muslims. You know, Ben Carson has done that a bunch of times, and you just saw Ted Cruz say Islamism, which I don't think is even a word. I guess, you know, basically leads to
here's the problem.
Terrorism.
You have people in this country who are Islamic, who come from the former Yugoslavia. Mm-hmm. You've got people here from Pakistan. Mm-hmm. Bangladesh, India, Indonesia. Yeah. Islamic people come from all around the world. It's 1.75 billion people. Right. They're not, first of all, if you bring it into a subset of Arabs even, it's like 300 million Arabs. Okay, let's get down to Arabs. Yeah. I mean, and then you get down to the small number of people who've given reason to be thought of as possible cell members. Like, let's face it, the French have been rounding up a lot of people who have a lot of guns.
Right, well, I mean, part of the issue is, you know, Americans at the moment are smothered in fear. I mean, there is a palpable fear of another terror attack in America. I mean, there's the ABC News has the new survey out just today, in fact, that showed that something like 81% of Americans are expecting a terrorist attack in America.
But have you seen the numbers are worse? People believe that they will be hit in a terrorist attack. Yeah, those numbers that blow my mind. How people actually think they're going to win the reverse of the
lottery.
Yeah, right, exactly. But when you think of how rare it actually is, as you're making the point, right?
I was going to say the Irish sweepstakes, you know, it's like one of those things like the chance are one in a millions.
And we've had Muslims come into this country for years. We have, and it's so rare that it occurs here in the United States, and yet there is this fear, palpable fear that it's going to happen, and of course the candidates respond to that, and when they respond
this
to
is
it,
the weird
people
part.
respond to that.
We all travel a lot. Guys who work in TSA come Islamic back, who are Islamic people. People that work in hotels are Islamic people. People who drive cars are...
My brother is a Muslim.
Yeah,
Chris.
I know.
My brother is a Muslim.
Okay, well,
we adopted a refugee
it's
from Afghanistan.
Around us, and yet it's
part of our
in
culture.
sight, and it's portrayed as some furtive operation.
Well, that's what's happening. You have the Republicans running these lead candidates who are equating Muslim or Islamic with terrorism. They're making this direct A to B point. And you got Jeb Bush and a few others pushing back, but that's the tone. Even John Kasich, who has seemed to be reasonable in the past, the other day called for a U.S. federal agency that would promote Judeo-Christian values around the world. So, like, they really want to make this an us versus Islam
I told them the opening.
Fight.
I said the opening, but I'm telling you, I said it during the break, I'll say it now loudly. If you believe the President of the United States, against every estimate of his life, every account of his life, everything about the Reverend Wright and all the rest, his family, everything about his history, if you still insist he's a foreigner, if you still insist he's from Africa, if you still insist he's a Muslim, then it's easy to say these guys coming in as refugees are dangerous.
And that he's doing it and that he's doing it on purpose. And you know, about 30–40% of the Republican base believes that.
Welcome back to Hardball. More now on the political fight over Syrian refugees coming to the U.S. Nowhere is this issue more relevant than the towns and cities directly affected. Allentown, Pennsylvania, for example, is home to one of the nation's largest populations of Syrians. It is a settled, established community there. 38 refugees, by the way, arrived in Allentown and Scranton between October of 14 and September of this year, according to the local press, and more on the way. Republican Congressman Charlie Dent grew up in Allentown. He represents the area, and he joins me now. Congressman, I'd love to know your thinking about this and how we deal with Syrian refugees now.
Sure. Well, thanks, Chris, for having me on the show. I do live in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and we do have one of the largest Syrian communities of any in the country. And I would let you know that the Syrian community that I represent is largely Christian. And many of them are outspokenly in support of Bashar al-Assad, the president of Syria. They're very pro-Assad. We have had some very tense moments here when there was an anti-Assad demonstration a couple of years ago, and it was met by a large pro-Assad rally. There was violence. All police were called out. So we've had some incidents. And I will tell you, though, that our Syrian community is well established. In fact, the Republican sheriff just elected, a good friend, Joe Hanna. He is a Syrian-American leader of that community. I've had conversations with him about this. The Syrian community, though, is, I think, somewhat split on the refugee question. I believe we've had about 8 families recently resettled in our area by the Lutherans. Some of the local Syrians feel that it is their obligation to open their hearts and their homes to their fellow Syrians, whether they be Muslim or different faith. Others are very concerned because of the pro-Assad, pro-government feelings of many of my local Syrians. They're concerned that many of the people coming are Islamic and are anti-regime, and that can create some tension.
So where do you stand on the issue of where have you been voting?
Oh, look, I supported the legislation the other day that would allow for a pause to allow us to just to better reinforce our existing programs on refugees. And by the way, I'm on the committee, the Appropriations Committee. I'm on the committee that actually does provide the funding for refugee assistance, and we provided over $3 billion of refugee assistance just in this fiscal year. $2.5 billion for the refugees overseas, $500 million here, and I'm not even counting the monies that we have for the unaccompanied children. So I understand we have a responsibility, but let's get this resettlement program right. I also just want to be clear, I don't believe the refugee issue is the major security threat. There is a threat. We have to take al-Qaeda at their word. They intend to penetrate or infiltrate some of the refugee communities, and so, but we should take them at their word. But I would also tell you, Chris, that the bigger threat, in my view, are Europeans who are citizens of various countries who are already radicalized and can enter our country by passports through the visa waiver program and come in this country very easily right now.
What can we do about that?
Well, we're going to have to look at it. We're going to be talking to our friends in Europe about ensuring that that we share information a lot better than we do. We have obviously a very robust terror watch list and a no-fly list. I don't think that we are as well coordinated with the European countries as we ought to be. We're going to look at it. We're not going to talk about shutting down the visa waiver program. It's just too darn important. There's a lot of Americans and Europeans who go back and forth on passports.
I know.
And obviously there would be a big economic effect. But I believe that's a greater threat to our country.
ISIS is demonstrating new ambition, reach, and capabilities. We have to break the group's momentum, and then it's back. Our goal is not to deter or contain ISIS, but to defeat and destroy ISIS.
We're back with the roundtable. Gene and Barrett and Eliana. That was former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, of course, laying out her plan this week to defeat ISIS. It was yesterday. It was a good week if you were a hawk running for president in 2016, but it was a bad week if your answer to the Paris attacks is to do nothing, or if you're the odd man out like Bernie Sanders. While his rival was outlining her plan to defeat terrorism, Sanders was defending socialism and laying out his attack against his country's, well, this country's billionaires.
The next time that you hear me attacked as a socialist, like tomorrow, remember this. I don't believe government should take over, the grocery store down the street or own the means of production. Democratic socialism means that we must reform a political system which is corrupt, that we must create an economy that works for all, not just the very wealthy. The billionaire class must be told loudly and clearly that they cannot have it all.
Eliana, what do you make of that this week, that speech?
This week was about terrorism. Bernie Sanders gave a speech largely focused on domestic politics, and so I really think it got lost in his delivery. But he's slipping in the polls, and he needed to deliver largely a broadside against Hillary Clinton. And I found it ironic in some ways that a lot of what he said, broadside against crony capitalism and dynasties in politics, are things that a lot of Republicans would actually agree with.
Well, I thought it was interesting, Barrett, that his definition of socialism is what you don't like right now. In other words, we socialists don't like billionaires controlling our political system. That's the new definition of socialism.
Right.
It's a convenient new definition. It's a great one.
Right. And I think this speech, he had to reframe the conversation. The title of socialist is something that Americans are not comfortable with. And that's a title that is on him. He has to have this conversation. It's going to be a difficult one for people to digest and get around, but he has to have this if he wants to.
Why now, after all his successes, does he feel the need to fight the definition that he has chosen all his career.
Yeah, I don't think he's fighting it.
it.
I think he's trying to explain it so that it's not scary to voters. You know, he's got to figure out some way to appeal to a broader base and some way to knock her off of her game. But they felt like he first needed to establish who he is. And to his credit, it is a definition of democratic socialism that fits the times. I'll agree with you on that.
Very conveniently. It fits the one thing he knows everybody hates, which is the Koch brothers and a few people.
But if you look
because
at Bernie,
of Citizens United being able to control our politics.
But Bernie's been saying this for a decade.
Not about Citizens United.
Not Citizens United.
Has
but
he been talking about billionaires for a decade?
Income inequality, yes,
he's been talking about this for a very long time. You can look at his...
Dr. Carson, I would think, on another subject, if he were playing Jeopardy, would not say foreign policy. I don't think a double Jeopardy. I think he would pick something along the lines of domestic moral issues or something. He didn't know to name one ally to fight ISIS on behalf of. He couldn't find... These are easy. Just say... Jordan, say something. He didn't have a name. I don't think he's familiar with the topic.
Yeah, look, I think there's a mistake Republican voters are making in thinking that because he's a neurosurgeon and he's smart, that he's informed. And the guy is clearly smart, but he is not informed about world politics. And when you're running for president, that's something of a problem.
Yeah, we've been waiting. Carson's been having a narrative that his intellect as a neurosurgeon can transfer over to the political realm. And we've actually been really patient to wait for that to happen. And thus far, it just hasn't transferred over. And now
it does. Well, things don't transfer over. My knowledge of basketball, because I always love basketball, my favorite sport because it's the fastest. I don't know anything about hockey. And everything I know about basketball tells me nothing about hockey. I can't name the players.
Exactly.
Even the Flyers. I know a lot about basketball, but that doesn't help me when it comes to hockey.
I think for Carson, it's an even bigger problem. I agree with everything they've said. His language is wrong. His knowledge isn't there. But I think he's got a temperament issue.
Welcome back to HARDBALL. The question of whether to allow Syrian refugees into the U.S. has become a hot political issue, of course. And for my next guest, it's personal. He's written about the story of desperate people fleeing the Third Reich and seeking refuge in America, only to be turned away by our government. In his case, it was Jewish people from Europe fleeing Nazi persecution. And they included his uncle and his grandfather, two men who eventually perished at Auschwitz. Martin Goldsmith's the author of a great book, Alex's Wake, A Voyage of Betrayal and a Journey of Remembrance. Martin, thank you for this. And you only have a little bit of time. How does this reawaken the echoes of what you lived through as a family member and what you studied?
The St. Louis came to this country 6 months after Kristallnacht, the pogrom of November 9th, 1938. And on board the St. Louis were more than 900 Jewish refugees, turned away first from Cuba for political reasons, and then from the United States and Canada. And the ship was so close to the coast of Florida that the people on board ship could see the lights of Miami during the couple of nights they were plying the waters off the coast of Florida. And Edward G. Robinson and other Hollywood stars sent telegrams to President Roosevelt to convince him to allow the passengers to get off in Miami. And yet the permission was denied. The ship sailed back across the ocean. And at the time, earlier in the show, you showed that 53% of Americans were against allowing Syrian refugees to come to this country. Interestingly enough, a Roper poll in 1938 showed that 53% of Americans thought the Jews were not like the rest of the populace, that they should be treated differently somehow. And 10% of the respondents to that poll said that Jews should be deported.
I mean, people who were here as Americans.
Exactly right. Jews living here in America. My grandfather and uncle on board the St. Louis sailed back to Europe. They got off ship in France, spent the next 3 years being sent from one camp to another before being sent to their deaths in Auschwitz in August of 1942. So yes, as you said earlier, it is personal. And when I hear these ideas of registries and keeping track of Muslims, I think of the cards that my grandfather and uncle had filled out.
Yeah, we should show them, but the pictures with the big J, the red J's.
J, yes, in Montauban in 1940, just days after the Statut des Juifs, the statute against the Jews.
There they are. We don't want that here. We do not want that here.